Welcome back to The Heat. The decision by Britain to leave the European Union and the rejection of Italy's referendum has brought a significant boost to populist forces across Europe. Key elections next year in France, Germany and the Netherlands could also impact the future of the European Union. Let's get back to our panel. Before we get back to the future of the European Union, Reinhard, Austria's Freedom Party has warned of what it called the Islamization of Europe and warned of a coming civil war on the continent. What can you tell us about this party, and is it this anti-immigrant sentiment that's driving these sentiments?
It certainly is an anti-immigrant sentiment, but what I think we need to mention when we talk about populist parties is populist parties are inherently opportunistic. They change and they adjust. In comparison to a dogmatic party, which has sort of clings to its principle, populist parties have an understanding for the flavor of the month and adjust. The Freedom Party used to be the first Austrian party to demand Austria's membership in the European Union, and had a rather different agenda because something else was popular. But now they know it used to be an anti-clerical party. Now they style themselves as defender of Christendom and Christianity and close to the Catholic Church. So they have a good sense of what is popular, what sells, and adjusting. They're like a chameleon, as Paul Taggart said, a scholar on populism. And I think that's one of the dangers. And I completely agree with Dominic before that we've seen a breakdown of left and right, and we've seen, and this is a crisis of legitimacy of established parties, but I think we also need to talk about the established parties and what they have not done and how they've sort of forgotten how to talk to people and how to rally them. And this is one of the issues I think that all the established European parties are facing at this time.
Okay, let's get to the future of the European Union. Paola, let's take a listen to what the European Union Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker had to say about current political trends in Europe. Let's watch.
Those who do think the time has come to deconstruct, to put Europe in pieces, to subdivide us in national divisions are totally wrong. We won't exist as single nations without the European Union.
So to what extent are all these things that are happening in Europe right now an indication that the European project might be failing?
Well, there are a lot of people think they jump to the obvious conclusion that the European project is going to fail. Actually, we can also look at it from the other point of view, which is all these trends perhaps and hopefully will give more force to the European project to reconsider, exactly as Juncker said in the bits you just transmitted, broadcasted, that to really rethink of the whole project and make it more flexible and more adaptable and for the current situation in Europe. And in March next year, we will celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome, which established the European Union as we know it. And that will really provide an opportunity to think about the next, I wouldn't say 60 years, but at least the next decade.
Dominic, does the European Union have to, I guess, adapt, retool, reconfigure in some way? Because if we look at what's happened in Britain, which has pulled out, what the talk is of in France, these are countries talking about getting out of it completely.
Absolutely, and we keep adding on the, Brexit, Nexit, Frexit, Czechsit. I mean, the list sort of goes on. I think that what's, important to remind ourselves is what is the European Union? The European Union is a family of nations brought together for peace and prosperity. And one of the things the European Union is not been doing a very good job of is partially because it has suffered recently a serious punch with Brexit, not yet a knockout punch, but there are indications that it is wilting, is I don't think it's done enough. And I say this speaking from a city like Berlin, where these questions are incredibly important historically, is that the European Union needs to do a better job of explaining what it does and of defending this vision of the world, which is absolutely at odds with the vision of these populist parties. The European Union has the potential to be an open, tolerant, and multicultural space. And what we're hearing from these populist parties is that that the world should move towards a kind of walled-up place, fighting against globalization, fostering intolerance, protectionism, nationalism, and so on. And I think that when the European Union starts to speak a little bit more about these kinds of questions, it will do a better job and have more chance of defending what it stands for. Having a referendum on the Italian constitution is an opportunity to get rid of a sitting prime minister. I think that if that vote had been on the European Union, the outcome could have been quite different, and the same thing would have applied to Austria. I still believe that most Europeans believe that the European Union is a positive entity. It's just that we need to do a better job of explaining what it does and how it helps people.
Ansgar.
I'm not so optimistic that it is just a question of explaining and of messaging the reason for being united in Europe. I think, as Paola said before, the European Union must become more flexible, but that means, on the other side, it has to become less integrated. I think the European Union did a very good job during the Cold War, but then in the beginning of the 90s, it made a mistake when it decided to increase the integration on two levels. The one level was the horizontal level when they decided to get new members in the eastern part of Europe. I think that was very useful and was very important to do. But at the same time, they decided to increase the level of vertical integration, and that was Maastricht Treaty and later the Lisbon Treaty and the idea of a constitution for Europe, and to do both things at the same time, to speed up the number of participants and member states, and at the same time to try to deepen the integration. That was a mistake, and I think Europe has to try to focus. I think it's important to have those Eastern European countries within the European Union, but then we have to decide, okay, give them a little bit more freedom, a little bit more of sovereignty, and many people in Europe today think the national states, and they are very old national states, as you know, are going to lose their sovereignty. And I think that's more important than saying we have to speak out louder about the message and about the reasons for the European Union.
Well, if I could just add, look, I'm not sure we really disagree here. I think that, if anything, the further expansion of Europe and the consolidation of working with countries to the east is going to become all the more important, particularly when one looks at the ways in which President-elect Trump seems to view the world in bilateral terms. The interest in the Soviet Federation, the ways in which the United States is going to move with foreign policy, means that certain countries in the east of Europe, particularly around NATO and so on, are going to be increasingly vulnerable. And it's going to be incredibly important for the European Union to come together and to express forcefully the importance of adherence for these particular countries, and to think about what this means for places like Lithuania, Latvia, and also down the road for countries like Ukraine.
Okay. Reinhard, you talked earlier on about the Donald Trump election victory here in the United States. What kind of inspiration does that offer to similar kind of movements in Europe? And, Trump hasn't even taken office yet. He takes office in January, next month. Is it going to get stronger for these movements in Europe? We've got 4 years to go here.
That remains to be seen. I think that's one of the interesting questions. But I think we continue to talk about Europe. I think we see populism on the rise from the Philippines to the United States. It's not just a question of Europe and European elites and what the European Union can and cannot do. It was interesting that initially the Freedom Party in Austria welcomed Brexit and welcomed Donald Trump, but after the sort of negative press coverage, they sort of took a step back and tried to de-emphasize their Euroscepticism. In fact, now the Freedom Party is now clear whether it wants to break with the European Union or not. So we have to watch and see. I think if the perception of Donald Trump will be that he makes life more risky I think it would backfire. But if on the other hand it's seen as a liberation, a sweeping change, it will be everything will be made new, taking the country back to some idealized past. And if they're able to communicate this, I think it will have a positive effect. I mean, I know that the Austrian Freedom Party has studied the Trump campaign very closely. They've paid very close attention, and populist parties in Europe learn from each other and study each other. So this is sort of one of the important questions. Certainly going to have an impact, but it could also have a negative impact. And I think the Austrian election has shown that it did have a negative impact, because right now the perception is sort of the risk has gone up rather than gone down. And to some extent, people are risk averse. However, I think ultimately these parties are a challenge to liberal democracy, a particular version of democracy, not democracy per se, but sort of our Western understanding of a liberal democracy. And I think that is what is at stake.
Okay, and we're going to have to end it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.